Our next panel, we have three participants, speakers, who are going to address loosely the topic of enmity and diplomacy. I try to come up with titles that will capture your attention, especially post-lunch. So whenever you start out with enmity, you know, at least hopefully people start paying attention. But of course, we want to end on, or include and end on more positive notes of diplomacy. So our next panel, we will focus on issues of hostilities between the North and the South, but especially the North's cyber attack programs, cyber war program strategies, and that's the enmity part. But we will also have Kayla, who will talk about espionage in the context of distrust and enmity that also leads to building bridges among cultures and countries in unintended ways. We would be looking at Germany and North Korea back in the 80s. And then we will end our panel with Mintaro, who will discuss the recent, last December 2015, agreement between South Korea and Japan on the comfort women issue. And he will discuss that in the context of larger strategic issues in East Asia. So let me start by introducing our first speaker, Jenny Jun. She's a PhD candidate at Columbia University in political science and the project team leader for a 2014-15 Center for Strategic and International Studies, which we know as CSIS, project on North Korea's cyber operations. She's also a co-author of the report called North Korea's Cyber Operations Strategy and Responses. Her accomplishments, her background, it's all listed in the bio, so I will cut it short and ask Jenny to come up to the podium. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming, and thank you, Dr. Moon, for organizing this wonderful conference, because I really also do believe that young scholars in particular can make a meaningful contribution to our respective fields, other than by having, a cheap hourly rate. Because we can really challenge, existing ways of thinking by, having grown up in a different environment, and that we're not yet beholden to sort of existing assumptions. And that's how really this project began too. So when North Korea launched a cyber attack on Sony a couple of years ago, most people's first reaction was, and especially coming from the technical community, was that, wait, but I thought they didn't even have electricity in North Korea. And so what that happened was that this assumption that North Korea was still sort of living under a rock really, in my opinion, widened the research gap between, the technical community and area studies. And, it really hindered thinking a little more deeply about how North Korea would use emerging technologies to their strategic end. So today, I'm going to try and bridge that gap a little bit and talk about not what just cyber weapons can do, but how a state can or cannot use cyber weapons to coerce an adversary. And we're going to look at two cases in which North Korea explicitly tried to use cyber attack for a coercion to see what works and what doesn't. And hopefully this is going to help all of us from a defender's perspective on how to prepare and form strategy on such things. Okay, before we begin, here's a quote that comes from one of the NIS testimonies at the South Korean National Assembly. And this quote is problematic for two reasons. First, Kim Jong-un seems to have a little bit of overconfidence in what a cyber weapon can do, is comparing it at the level of nuclear weapons and missiles. And second, NIS, by not adding much analysis as to whether the statement is true or false, is sort of reinforcing our collective belief that cyber weapons is really this magic sword. And so as analysts, we need to, not take these quotes as verbatim, but sort of ask questions. And sort of this is what we hope to explore in today's presentation. A little overview of the contents. and quickly jumping to a quick overview of North Korea's cyber operations, just so we're all on the same page. So North Korea's cyber efforts are a natural progression from their existing missions, coming from electronic warfare, information warfare, and to another extent, covert action and irregular military operations. And naturally, that puts their cyber unit under the Reconnaissance General Bureau that has traditionally handled a lot of these things. And so this is where their sort of thinking and strategic thoughts on cyber activity comes from. And by now, over the past couple of years, they've really expanded their operations, and they're now active in a wide range of malicious activity in cyberspace, including espionage, cybercrime, and this cut off at the bottom, but also destructive cyber operations, which is mostly what we're going to focus about today. And as a caveat, studying North Korea is hard, and studying cyber is really hard because of the sort of the information gap. A lot of things are classified. We don't have direct access to a lot of the information that we're dealing with, and so verifiability and falsifiability is a big concern. But we have to start somewhere. So hopefully this is the beginning of a larger effort on this topic. So quickly going over some elements of coercion to sort of get our thinking into the space. Ability to coerce is often an important element of estimating states' power. And coercion is divided into largely, compellence and deterrence. Compellence is basically, getting someone to do something that they otherwise wouldn't want to do. Deterrence is getting someone not to do something that they otherwise would not want to do. And, today's presentation will mostly focus on using cyber for compellence purposes. And often, states achieve this through making threats, especially when you don't have that much, carrots to offer. And two things that really go into making a threat credible and effective are a demonstration of capability, and two, and the communication of the threat before the event actually happens. And what I mean by communication of the threat is it has to be contingent. So in the form of if you do this, then I'm going to do this, and also specific as to what you're going to do if if they do or don't do what you want them to do. So then how do we, apply this in cyberspace and, explore how coercion works in cyberspace? And, a little bit of a spoiler alert is that it's not actually as easy as you think. So we're going to look at sort of two large case studies that involve North Korea, where North Korea deliberately tried to threaten, their, opponent by making threats in relation to their cyber means. So what most people focus on in the Sony case is the actual attack on November 24th, where the cyber attack happened on Sony headquarters. But what's really more interesting is how North Korea structured its threats before and after November 24th in order to get theaters and Sony to pull down the movie Interview. And North Korea has actually been protesting about the movie starting from around June, and they've threatened action, countermeasures and retaliatory action against U.S. government and Sony multiple times from the summer, but it really largely went ignored, mostly because the threat wasn't specific, and largely they couldn't really demonstrate capability that they are able to do such things, directly coerce an adversary that's across the Pacific. So after Sony happened, however, and as you all know, it made a really big fuss in U.S. government and in the private sector in general, they made another threat around December 16th, where the Guardians of Peace, who are later sort of attributed to be North Korean APT group, they warned a 911 style cyber attack on U.S. cinemas if the movie is released, and this time the threat was actually effective. It scared a lot of the movie theaters and mostly Sony, and Sony ended up pulling down all of the movies, and which later on turned out to be the threat was a bluff. Basically, from a technical standpoint, the ability to hack Sony doesn't translate to the ability to hack into movie theaters. But because of sort of the clear demonstration of capability, Sony actually backed down from this incident. So moving on to the next case study, KHNP stands for Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power Plant, and they're the agency that oversees all the hydro and nuclear power plants in South Korea. This is a little bit of a lesser-known case, but it's a really good example of cyber coercion, failing to work. So around the same time, in 2004, unknown hacker group named Who Am I, who was also later attributed to be, a North Korean APT group, started releasing a bunch of personal information and basically nuclear power plant blueprints online, and alleging that they have access to, and the capability to, compromise nuclear power plants in South Korea. And on December 23rd, they made a specific threat to say, if you don't shut down 3 nuclear power plants by Christmas, we're going to launch a secondary strike. The thing is, by articulating this threat beforehand, it really did something interesting. Is it alerted the Korean government and employees of KHNP, and basically everyone went into an emergency lockdown, and they did 24/7 monitoring of every single network traffic. They scanned every system for viruses, and there were basically there were Marines outside guarding the nuclear power plants. And they scanned everything, and they found out that there was actually no compromise, and as to what they were alleging to. So December 25th came, and nothing happened, and so the crisis was averted, and this hacker group, never was able to sort of, produce credibility in any other way. So what this has, as for the implications is that, at the micro level, if you just look at the operation itself, coercion is not as easy as you think, and mostly because, an operation based on, malware, they hinge on secrecy. So, think of it as like covert action. And also a successful exploitation of a particular system vulnerability, which doesn't really translate to other systems. So the fact that you hacked into Sony doesn't mean that you can use the same tools to hack into a nuclear power plant or a government network. And so what makes this particularities of the weapon difficult is that it's really difficult to communicate a threat beforehand, because doing so alerts the other side, and it allows them to do a scan and clean up everything before the attack actually happens. And also, secondly, it really hinders the demonstration of capability before the actual attack happens. And so because coercion hinges on sort of the restraint on the part to hurt, it's really hard to do that with a malware-based cyber operation. And an exception might be something like DDoS or ransomware, but we have yet to see such weapons being in application in the coercive sense. And going a little bit into the other side of the debate, but at the macro level, with some work, cyber means might be useful, and this might be particularly attractive for North Korea to think about, who has a lot of limited means in other areas. So, for example, first, cyber operations can achieve range. For example, when you don't have a means to directly coerce someone who's across the Pacific, maybe, given the fact that they're developing ICBMs, it might be a little bit of a different story now. But, other than ICBMs, it sort of gives them a direct means of coercion. Second, cyber means can be used to boost credibility in another domain. So, for example, if you're blocking information access, if you're blocking communications, it boosts your capability for other conventional operations or missiles or other conventional operational situations. So it could be used in that way. Also, what's interesting is that for you to build a reputation for being, a really strong cyber actor in the international community, what you might have to do is to build that reputation, that general belief that you are capable in the cyber domain through actually conducting repeated attacks and repeated, known compromises. And so what this, can be potentially problematic is for North Korea to sort of prove their cyber capability. They might need to actually conduct attacks like Sony to convey that they actually have these capabilities. And the last thing is technology is still evolving, very fastly in a very fast manner in cyberspace. So with the intent to use, cyber means in a coercive manner, people, not just North Korea, but private sector or other entities can invest into technologies that would allow them to use cyber means for coercive effects, in ways that allow them to demonstrate capability, in ways that allow them to create sort of an ex-ante communication of threat. So that's something to watch out for. And so what this comes down to is a series of policy questions that I'm going to leave you with. And so first of all is it's in a theoretical sense, how do you deal with this incentive to conduct actual attacks in order to demonstrate capability and build reputation? And second of all, which is sort of specific to North Korea, is how do you deter someone when they're not themselves reliant on information systems for their daily activity, and therefore can't really create, like in the nuclear, domain, can't really create sort of a mutual hostage situation. And third, from a crisis management perspective, and this is where I guess diplomacy comes in, is under uncertainty where you don't know whether this threat is credible or not. How do you devise, a certain set of, procedures and structures and information, finding mechanisms so that when you're Sony and you're attacked and they're, threatening a secondary strike, how do you sort of manage that and get through that moment of uncertainty and avert a crisis? So with that, I'm gonna, leave you to the next presenter. Thanks.
I'd like to invite Kayla up to the table. Kayla comes from a great distance, all the way from the Woodrow Wilson Center. But she has traveled many great distances in her young life in terms of where she's lived and also her intellectual linguistic travels. I think last night we realized that she probably covers about 2/3 of the languages among all of the participants here, from Korean, German, ancient Greek, Russian, Spanish,
and Chinese.
She also has 2 BAs, one which includes linguistic. How do you say that?
Languaculturalism.
Languaculturalism.
Cross-cultural.
This is a generational difference. I don't even understand it. But anyway, very admirable. And she has some very fascinating research that she conducted at the Woodrow Wilson Center. She is an officer there working in the History Project and the Cold War History Project. And she's going to talk to us about German spies, espionage in North Korea, and meeting up with West Germans and South Koreans as well through the eyes of this one particular agent.
Yes. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So as Dr. Moon already mentioned, my topic today is going to cover something that is not generally spoken about when it comes to North-South Korean relations or Korean studies in general, and that is the topic of East Germany-North Korea relations, bilateral relations. And I'm going to talk about this through a particular lens, a historical perspective, as I look at archival research that was retrieved from the Stasi archives in East Germany. And my hope today is that by the end of this presentation, you not only have had a little bit of fun learning about East Germany espionage, but you also see and have an interest in the historical information we have and have access to on North Korea. So hopefully this will spark your interest in archival research and historical perspectives. And with that preface, let me tell you a story about a spy. Our story begins in 1980s in East Germany. Here's a photo of an East German city in the early 1980s. That's approximately 1980. And if you can all see, what what I want you to notice about this photo are the people on the streets. So as you can see that there at the bottom, the people on the streets. For us as a modern audience, this photo, for some of us more so than others, this photo looks a little old. We can tell it's not from this present day. It's not from, for some of us, it's not from recent history in our memories. And in some cases, for people if they're even young enough, this might look almost otherworldly, this kind of other perspective. But for the people in this photo, this moment that's caught in the camera, by the camera, this is their here and now. This is their present. Like this photo, archival documents have a way of pulling us out of our own temporal mindset and perspectives and placing us into the everyday aspect, life perspectives of people who came before us in the past. And in some senses, you could say this is almost like time traveling back to other perspectives that we did not experience ourselves, but we can now learn through the archival research. And this is what made me so interested in doing this research and these documents, because not only was it like reading a spy novel, but everything that happened actually did happen. So now that I've set the stage and I've given you a little bit of context, I've set the stage. Now the question is of the character for the story. Who was the spy, and why was he important or different for this time period? As you can see from the photo on the side there, I've intentionally led you astray. The spy was not actually a man, she was a woman. And not only was she a woman, she was an East German woman who born in the 1930s. And these documents that I have specifically focus on the 80s, but she has experiences that go back before that. So I actually do know her full information. I know where she was born. I know her full name. Through my colleagues and people I've spoken with, she has passed away, unfortunately, a couple years before I even started this research, which is a little bit of a bummer because I would have loved to have the opportunity to speak with her directly on her experiences. But yeah, so she not only was an East German woman, but she was an East German woman who spoke Korean fluently, held a PhD in Asian history, and was a professor at a major East German university and she was a professor on Korean history specifically. Her interest in East Asia started young. She did an undergraduate, her undergraduate studies was in history and sinology, and she had the opportunity, a unique opportunity, to travel to North Korea to study abroad for 2 years, studying Korean language and Korean history. Once she returned from North Korea, she continued her research, she did a little bit more work, and then she actually went back, this time as a member of the East German embassy workers, and she was actually the cultural attaché for several years additionally. So by the time she was in her mid-30s, she had lived in North Korea for almost approximately 5 years and was fluent in Korean language. And this, once again, is an East German woman living at the time of returning in the 60s at that point, which is just absolutely fascinating, just a fascinating, fascinating woman. And so by the time of the documents that I have, I do know that documents do exist from her time in North Korea, specifically her time at the embassy. I don't have access currently to those, but through connections, I'm hoping to expand research and have access to those as well. The documents I have today are from the 80s. So this is a very different Dr. Inga Bergutto. This is a Bergmann who is later in her life experiences. She's in her 50s, and she's been working as a professor for many years. And she even mocks her unique situation almost, because not only is she older demographically and further along in her life experiences, but she has these wonderful skills and attributes, and she mocks her unique situation when she quote-unquote applies to become a spy, and by referring to herself as a woman over 50, and so it's a Frau über 50, and so that was a really interesting kind of tidbit there, and I'll discuss. And I have a tendency to talk very quickly. And I'll discuss a little bit more about why I said applies in a minute. But first, I want to share you a story in case this hasn't already whet your appetite and gotten you thinking about this interesting topic, to tell you a little bit of a story. So accelerating a little bit into these documents. In 1984, Dr. Inga Bergutto had the opportunity to travel to South Korea for a conference or research. I'm not particularly sure. It's not as specific in the documents. During her trip, and first off, this is very interesting because already then she was positioned where she knew enough people in South Korea and she was respected as a professor. She had published a couple of books, like hundreds of articles, and she was respected enough to be invited to conferences in South Korea. During her trip, she did have a minder. So it's similar to what people talk about in North Korea traveling there. So when she was in South Korea, she had a minder, and she was being taken from point A to point B and going here and there. And at one point, they get in the car and they are driving down the road. And the car stops, and she looks out the window, and she sees written above the door, it says Institution for North Korean Studies. And so at this point, obviously, warning bells are going off in her head. Why have they brought her to the Institution for North Korean Studies? She had been in North Korea in the past, and there's a possibility that she also did spy work in North Korea. But now this is in the 80s, and this is way past that. So the question was, what's going on with this? She enters the building, and her minor stays in the hallway. The minor's not allowed into the room. She enters the room, and for lack of a better term, there are 12 interrogators waiting for her in that room. And a 3-hour conversation starts where they start drilling her, asking her about her opinions on North Korea and her perspectives. And this was almost, I don't want to say a hazing period, but it was a period where they were trying to figure out what did she know and what was her perspective. Was she pro-North Korea? Was she pro-South Korea? And it was a very interesting situation. And one of the parts that stick out the most to tell you about her character and her interesting perspectives is that at one point, this conversation got very serious, and she describes that, got very serious, and they asked her very seriously, after the Korean War, did East Germany provide North Korea with funding to rebuild? This is a very serious question. Apparently, this was boiled down to a lot of what they were talking about. And she replied simply and confidently, well, yes, we did. And if you go to the South Korean University, in the library, you will find my book, and you can read all about it. So this is the kind of woman that Ingeborg Gutel was. And so this is a fascinating character. And with that, I'm gonna go back in a little bit and speak a little bit about the documents. So here's an image of 2 of the folders. So I'll talk a little bit about Stasi documents and the Ministry for State Security in a minute. So if you're not as familiar with East German history, I'll get into that. But first, I want you to notice that there's a folder labeled 1 and a folder labeled 2. And the wonderful thing about this is I actually had access to both of these folders. And the important thing is that folder 1 is her personnel folder. That's where I know all of her background information, because they keep a very solid record, and they ask that applicants, in a lot of ways, if once you are invited or coerced into joining to become a secret informer, you're asked to submit background paperwork information and to say why you're good. And so not everyone did it because they wanted to join. Maybe there was coercion involved, but they do have the background information. So because of that, I know all of her details. And then number 2 is her operations folder, and that's what's going to be really interesting for us to look at. Really quick, just a shameless plug and a shout out. I had access to these documents through the Woodrow Wilson Center's digital archive, so I'm going to give them a shout out for that. I also want to give a shout out to Professor Bernd Schaefer, who actually was in Germany, gathered these documents and brought them back to us. So I did not have to travel myself, in a lot of ways he did the hard work for me. Okay, so for those of you not as familiar with East German history as you may be with North or South Korean history, the Stasi was a short name for the Ministry of State Security. That was founded in 1950. The Ministry for State Security, in German, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, was a powerful, omnipresent domestic and foreign surveillance apparatus. It had full authority when it came to police force matters and intelligence. It had foreign intelligence agencies. It also had detention centers, local offices, and its own armed forces. The Stasi referred to itself as the shield and sword of the party. Similar to the North Korean party system, the MFS, which is also another acronym for Stasi, answered only to the head of the East German party, the SED, the Socialist Unity Party for East Germany. It's a little interesting to look in the past and see how this matches up. So okay, so moving on. I want to speak a little bit about the actual documents. So these are excerpts from the documents. So you can't look at these documents without having some very long German words. So at the top of this, it says Blitzfeld Maßnahmen. And this is a very Stasi-like term. It was created by the Stasi. And it means, Blitzfeld means field of vision, and Maßnahmen means action or mission. And so through these documents, you were able to see what they were wanting to use Ingeborg for and how to use her skills. So not only, and I'm not going to go into detail, but not only did she have remarkable skills because she had experience as a diplomatic historian, had experience with Asian history and culture, but also she had contacts with the South Korean South Korean context in West Berlin. And these are some of the reasons. And we'll get into those a little bit. So what's really interesting about these documents is that during the 80s, she came in contact with an individual living in West Berlin who was associated in some way with the South Korean General Consulate. And through her access to academic and university opportunities, she was able to have research trips to the library, the university library in West Germany, to meet with this individual and speak. And there was a series of meetings that started roughly around January 1984 all the way through February 1888 with this individual and the individual that came after this individual. And these conversations were very friendly in some ways, but at the same time, trading a lot of information was happening. And it was definitely, in a lot of senses, a game of, oh my. Oh, okay. Okay. So we can see the titles at least. Okay, so mistrusting friends. So, and there was a lot of conversation and negotiation happening, but it's also at the same level a game of espionage. Both Ingeborg Gutel, codename Bergmann, and her correspondent clearly knew that they were engaging with each other for the purpose of gaining information. Questions were asked, topics were brought up with the intent of seeing how the other person responded and how they engaged. Just one second. Also, incentives were provided and made, so there was kind of this negotiating back and forth, and this concept, and a lot of what we refer to as spy as the power of knowledge. And Ingeborg played this wonderfully. Not only did she play the game with the people she was interacting with, both North Koreans and South Koreans, giving them a little bit of information here and taking things back different ways, but she also played it with her superiors because, unlike the way the documents talk, she says that she was inspired to join the Stasi because she wanted to better East German society. I think what she really was trying to do was have access to leaving East Germany and engaging with South Koreans and North Koreans to continue her research and her passion for East Asian studies. And so that's another interesting tidbit. Okay, we're good there then. All right, so briefly wrapping up, some of the things that I can't go into bigger detail is the specific incidents that occurred during the time of these documents. So all of these events that are listed here, and I can't speak to them specifically right now, but you can ask me in Q&A as well, are events that she witnessed as an East German engaging with both South Koreans and North Koreans on the topics. And so if there's two things I'd like you to take away from this conversation, it is one, that history is not dead. So contrary to popular belief, that things that happened in the past do relate to a lot of the things that happen today. And the second thing is that the issue of North-South Korean relations is an interdisciplinary issue, an issue that is not just based in the politics, it's not just based in the history, it's based in the social cultural interactions that do occur and the linguistic exchanges that do happen. I'm a strong believer in interdisciplinarianism, and I'm a strong believer that social culturalism can help change and interact and better the world. So if we can leap over the temporal distances, the time differences, and break through the disciplinary boxes we put ourselves into that somehow make people think that certain information is inconsequential to when it comes to North-South Korean relations, imagine the knowledge that could be gained from the past and the present to better the possibility of a future. All right, with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kayla, and I hope you catch your breath. Last, our speaker on this panel is Mintaro Oba, who most recently served in the State Department as the Korea Desk Officer. He was an indispensable part of the East Asia expertise in the State Department. And he is currently with the West Wing Writers. This just sounds so fascinating and fun. He's also, as I mentioned in my introduction, that he represents, again, this non-silo existence and cross-fertilization and cross-ventilation. He's served in government. He's also been active in NGOs regarding North Korean human rights. He is a writer. He makes his own video casts, does all sorts of interesting things. And most importantly, we're lucky to have him with us today to talk about Korea-Japan, the agreement last December on the comfort women issue, and the different actors and the drivers that led to it. Mintaro, would you like to take the podium, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. As you know, this is my favorite Korea think tank, so happy to be here. I'm also going to do a very un-Korean thing and not have a PowerPoint today, so I hope you bear with me. Couple of disclaimers at the top. I left the State Department as a Korea desk officer about 3 weeks ago. So a lot of my experience at the State Department informs how I think about policy issues, but what I'm saying today is very personal opinions and assessments and doesn't necessarily reflect the government's position on things. The second disclaimer is that I am currently a speechwriter, but I didn't write a speech for myself, so no judgment today. All right, so today I'm talking about the so-called Comfort Women Agreement between Korea and Japan that was concluded in December of last year. It was a very courageous political act by Korean President Park and Japanese Prime Minister Abe. At the government-to-government level, implementation has been fairly smooth. A foundation has been created. Issues of funding have been worked out. At the people-to-people level, the issue is a lot more complicated. We've seen protests, we've seen threats of lawsuits by at least 12 Comfort Women survivors, and we've seen threats to erect statues. So public opinion in Korea has been fairly skeptical of this Comfort Women Agreement. As you know, it's a top strategic priority for the United States that there are improved Korea-Japan relations. That's why we've been very focused on the implementation of the Comfort Women Agreement, and that's why this administration has ramped up efforts on trilateral US-Japan-Korea cooperation. The Secretary of State has continued with annual ministerial-level trilateral meetings with his Korean and Japanese counterparts. Deputy Secretary Tony Blinken has really taken charge of the trilateral issue. He spoke here at Brookings on his vision for the US-Korea-Japan trilateral partnership, and he's instituted quarterly US-Korea-Japan trilateral meetings to spur action in the trilateral partnership. And we've seen some results from that. We've seen increased cooperation on health security. Vice President Biden recently chaired a meeting with the US, Korean, and Japanese health ministers in support of the Cancer Moonshot Initiative. The Ambassador at Large for Women's Issues at the State Department just hosted a trilateral women's empowerment forum. And in the Secretary's recent meeting on the margins of the UN General Assembly with his Korean and Japanese counterparts, they agreed to strengthen trilateral cooperation on North Korea coming so soon after this last North Korean nuclear test. So that's all very important. So overall, it's been a pretty mixed picture in terms of follow-up to this Comfort Women Agreement. And I think a lot of people are asking legitimate questions about whether this agreement is sustainable, whether this trilateral progress is sustainable. And to answer that question, I think you have to look at the overall trajectory of ROK-Japan relations over time. There have been several good periods in the Korea-Japan relationship that I want to call your attention to today. The first is dating back to the formal normalization of relations between Korea and Japan. They concluded the normalization treaty in June 1965, and it was a 14-year negotiation from October 1951 to June 1965. The second period is several decades later, 1983 to 1984, when Yasuhiro Nakasone was the Japanese prime minister and Chun Doo-hwan was the Korean president. And surprisingly, in November of 1983, almost as soon as Nakasone won election as the Japanese prime minister, he placed a call to Chun Doo-hwan, which was totally unprecedented for a Japanese leader at the time. Later, he used the formulation that Japan deeply tense for its actions during World War II. And his first trip as prime minister was to Seoul, breaking a long string of precedent that Washington would be the first stop for a Japanese prime minister. And he extended $4 billion of credits and grant aid to Korea. And in 1984, Chun also visited Tokyo. And the third case of good ROK-Japan relations. In 1998, October 1998, Keizo Obuchi was the Japanese prime minister. He expressed deep remorse and heartfelt apologies, which built on a statement by the former opposition prime minister Murayama, but it was significant in that it was a formal government statement in a written form. And the Korean president at the time, Kim Dae-jung, expressed that he thought that would finally settle the issue, which sounds awfully familiar today. And they issued a very sweeping joint declaration about, the new Japan-Korea partnership heading into the 21st century. So the puzzle with all of these cases is, first, why did these good periods of Korea-Japan relations happen in the first place? And second, why were we not able to sustain those periods of good relations? And there are a couple of big theories that I think people are very familiar with in ROK-Japan relations. First, most recently, Scott Snyder and Brad Glosserman published a book on the Japan-Korea identity clash, talking about how some of these almost irreconcilable ideational differences, this very fluid process of ideational negotiation in both Japan and Korea really complicates the possibility of any long-term reconciliation. And the second was some time ago, but it was Victor Cha's book, Alignment Despite Antagonism. And he sets out the theory that what explains variations in Japan-Korea relations is their relationship with their mutual ally, the United States. When they feared being abandoned or entrapped by the United States, they countered that by looking for closer relations with each other. And I agree with those theories in part. My argument about why these good periods in ROK-Japan relations happened is that they happened through strategic initiative, mostly on the Japanese part, especially by conservatives, and when the Japanese understood that good ROK-Japan relations would be in their interest. That in combination with a bit of healthy pressure from the United States. So looking back at the normalization treaty, that was a 14-year-long negotiation. It was stalled for most of the time because of this heated anti-Japan sentiment in Korea. So why did it finally take shape? Well, if you look at the declassified documents from that time, you see that it mostly has to do, in Korea with Park Chung-hee taking power, and in Japan, consensus forming among the most conservative factions of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party that Japan needed to normalize relations with Korea, and that was important. And it came from the strident anti-communism of those conservative LDP factions, and the realization that if Japan's strategy was going to be based on that premise, that they needed to normalize relations with Korea. And also, if you look at documents from that time, you'll see talking points from the United States very actively encouraging this normalization process along. And it's actually quite eerie how similar those talking points are to what the United States says to Korea and Japan today. Second case, on the Nakasone era, here you have a very strategic, conservative Japanese prime minister as well. He is the one who's most famous for calling Japan America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. And he had strong anti-communist credentials as well. And so that that sort of drove his reputation as a maverick, and it drove his unusual strategy of engaging the Republic of Korea. Now, why didn't those, thank you, why didn't those good periods last? I think it's because of the issues that Scott Snyder and Brad Glossman identified with national identity. You know, I think Dr. Moon has cited someone who told her that militarism is in Japan's DNA. And these are things you hear from Koreans a lot. These sweeping generalizations about Japan. And it's very clear that Koreans have to negotiate this role that Japan plays as the other in Korean society. And that is a very deep-seated issue rooted in history, and it's not going to be swept away by any sort of government-to-government agreement. But it is possible to slowly build government-to-government relations based on a convergence of interests. And I think that's why the Japanese have so often driven that, because they have a stronger strategic interest in countering China and earlier countering anti-communism. I've heard a lot of views expressed by Koreans that they don't really need Japan. Insofar as they need Japan for North Korea, the United States as an ally is going to string Japan along. And so that's sort of at the root of why it's very difficult to get action on ROK-Japan relations. So in terms of policy recommendations, I'd say that to build on this Comfort Women agreement, we need to foster a very long-term reconciliation effort at the people-to-people level, not just at the government-to-government level. It needs to be a very sincere and frank and respectful discussion, and both Japan and Korea need to negotiate these history and identity issues at this level. Japan needs to take initiative to follow up on the Comfort Women agreement and go above and beyond that to address issues with textbooks and history and demonstrate sincerity. But there is also an obligation on Korea's part to reciprocate in kind. But for that long-term reconciliation effort at the people-to-people level to take place, you need good government-to-government relations. That creates the political space for that sort of negotiation of identity. That's why the United States has been undertaking these major trilateral efforts. Now, the key thing we need to do differently from other times when we've had good ROK-Japan relations is expand the constituencies for good ROK-Japan relations. In the past, there's been a very limited constituency that really benefits from good ROK-Japan relations. And I think as you've seen from domestic policies, such as Obamacare or Social Security, that were heatedly debated when they came out, they developed a constituency because they became indispensable to people. So the whole point of trilateral cooperation today is to come up with cooperation using this brief period of warm ROK-Japan relations to do things that expand the constituencies and increase the groups and actors that benefit from ROK-Japan relations. That's what the Cancer Moonshot Cooperation's been about, and that's what the Women's Empowerment Cooperation's been about, and that's what the North Korea Cooperation's been about. And my final recommendation is to not neglect the informal level. A lot of Japanese diplomacy is done, party to party with the LDP and between these big business associations, and we need to engage those very closely to really develop a comprehensive, strong ROK-Japan relationship. Thank you.
I'd like to invite the speakers to come up for Q&A. And for the sake of time, I'm going to withhold questions of my own and open up to the audience, and I will interject when necessary. So I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time and give our speakers a chance to respond. But also, you're welcome to question one another, comment on one another's work, etc. Yes.
Michael Marshall, Global Peace Foundation. I'm tempted to ask Mr. Oba whether the Korean diplomats he dealt with as the a State Department officer did a double take when they found someone of ethnic Japanese descent at the Korea desk of the State Department. But I'll ask another question, and that is, you talked about the anti-Japanese feeling in Korea, rooted in history. But a phenomenon that's puzzled me is that seems to have continued into the younger generation. You would think that things rooted in history would grow weaker over time. That doesn't seem to have been the case. Do you have any insights onto why that should be so? I mean, I recognize this is an extremely complex problem.
I'd like to take another question before we go to our panelists. Yes.
Thanks. My name is Dilshad Othman, and I'm a cybersecurity researcher. My question is for Jenny. Do you see any malware attacks targeting North Korean defectors? And is it advanced or... Thanks.
Interesting. Let's take one more. There's one back there.
Hello, my name is Jiwon Kong. I'm from the Center for the National Interest. My question is towards Mr. Oba. You've mentioned that it is important to build some kind of reciprocal endeavors to, to have a better relationship within Korea and Japan. But I believe one very important factor that kind of impediments this process is that there's a lot of political burden for Korean leaders to be actually building a good relationship with Japan because of the history. There are a lot of critics saying that those choices of leaders having better relationship with Japan is actually rooted from their pro-Japanese history. Like, for example, current President Park Geun-hye, her father is in a lot of debate whether he was actually in pro-Japanese personal records or not. So I believe without solving those personal relationships that are related to pro-Japanese things, then I think it's still impossible to have for leaders to choose a better relationship with Japan. So do you still think that it is actually necessary for us to start building better relationship at this stage, or whether if it's possible for Korean leaders to do that?
Okay, I think Mintaro, you have a couple questions there that are pretty heady, so we'll give you a little time to prepare them. Maybe we could go to Jenny first.
Thank you. So I don't know if it's appropriate for me to sort of disclose the names of the organizations that's being targeted, so maybe we can talk in private afterwards. But I would just like to say that there are a lot of instances where not necessarily the defectors themselves, but where there are websites where they house a lot of information about North Korea. For example, newspapers that deal with North Korean issues, organizations of defector websites. So malware analysts have actually found evidence that a lot of these websites are sort of houses of watering hole attacks. So a lot of the visitors who come to these websites would then, get malware on their, computers through watering holes, and that's how they get compromised. And it's just a good way for North Korea to select their target group based on, what their interests are. So we can talk probably more.
Could you just define watering holes for those less technologically able?
Sure. So it's when you compromise the website and you embed a malicious a link. So when they click on certain links that's embedded in the website, it takes you to another phony website, which automatically sort of downloads malware onto your computer. And so anyone who comes to the watering hole gets sort of infected. That's the whole idea.
So I think the first question was about anti-Japanese sentiment continuing into the younger generation, counter to the expectation that it might grow weaker with time due to the distance from history. And I suppose I don't really agree with the premise that that sense of identity grows weaker as you get distant from history. We still reference, the Boston Tea Party or the American Revolution in our country's narrative. And so I think our distance from those things actually, makes those more potent in our historical narrative. And, it's a big part of our identity. And so I think the fact that anti-Japanese sentiment is continuing into the younger generation and possibly even growing stronger, strongly supports the notion that putting Korea into opposition with Japan is not about the immediate history that happened right after World War II, but an essential part of Korean identity today. And I think you also see that with Korean Americans, many of whom, at least in my personal experience, are very anti-Japanese. And it's almost as if being virulently anti-Japanese or supporting the establishment of comfort women statues in the United States is sort of proving a sense of Korean identity for Korean Americans. So the second question was about the political burden that ROK leaders face in pursuing Korea-Japan relations. Yeah, I really do agree with that. I think Korean leaders face a very unpermissive domestic political environment. They face these very passionate views, and Korean government officials, Korean diplomats are very, very sensitive to the views of their people, and they also have a very aggressive press. So these are all constraints on the freedom of action of Korean leaders to take any sort of initiative in Korea-Japan relations. And I should have explained better in my presentation, one of the main reasons I suggest that it is sort of on the Japanese side to take initiative is because of these domestic constraints that exist on the Korean side. I think Japanese political leaders have much more freedom to take initiative in Korea-Japan relations. That being said, an improved relationship is in the U.S. strategic interest, and it's going to be very important to encourage the Koreans to reciprocate any Japanese initiative on that.
Thank you. I want to add a couple things here just to thicken the stew in a way. So far, there is this assumption that Koreans, especially younger Koreans, are not decreasing their anti-Japanese sentiment, and there are many surveys that you can choose that support one way or the other. There are surveys that show that there is a generational component to anti-Japanism, primarily older generations having anti-Japanese sentiments that are stronger and more consistent and long-lived than younger, that the younger generations are more cosmopolitan and have not necessarily a Pan-Asian identity, but at least a Pan-Asian sensibility of sorts, usually through pop culture. So we can cut this in many ways. One thing I want to make very clear is that even when South Koreans do engage in nationalist rhetoric and the purchasing of nationalistic propaganda and commodities, that does not mean that they don't actually have positive, constructive relationships with individual Japanese. Japanese and South Korean NGOs, for example, on the environment, on peace, on women's issues, on a variety of issues, work very well together, and they have worked very well together even in the periods of very, very heavy civil society tensions. So I think we have to be very careful. It's dangerous to paint Korean civil society as this monolithic group that is anti-Japanese and vice versa, Japanese toward the South Koreans. It's just not the reality. I think there are individuals in South Korea in the civil society that have learned to be very, very strategic and manipulative about the sentiments. Anti-Japanese sentiment, about issues of pro-Japanese collaborators in the past. And so we have to also separate civil society leaders who have their own agendas and their ideologies and therefore lead their groups in certain ways that end up increasing the volume of, the vocal volume, the audio volume of anti-Japanism, but that does not necessarily mean there's a high intensity. I'm borrowing Ji-Eun Bang's language. It doesn't mean there's a high intensity of real hostility or enmity, okay? Rhetoric is rhetoric, action is action. What leaders say, civil society leaders say, versus what people do in their own private lives with friends in Japan, visiting them or Skyping them or working on projects with them are very different things. I also want to address here the issue, I think it's interesting, the issue of Korean Americans and the nationalist sentiment regarding comfort women issue has come up. This is a very complicated issue. It's not just, in my view, a matter of Korean Americans identifying as ethnic Koreans and therefore exhibiting ethno-nationalism. It has a lot to do with using specific issues that will give them a political voice in the American political environment. How many issues do Korean Americans actually have that can get attention in Washington, D.C.? Not many. Comfort women issue actually is one of them because of the House resolution that was passed in 2007, 2008, right? Because already Congress had acknowledged this issue, Korean Americans jumped on this issue and therefore started putting up street signs, comfort women statues, etc. Of course, there were Korean Americans who led the HR 121 resolution, the activist movement, but it wasn't just Korean Americans. And those Korean Americans, especially the younger generation who were active in the Comfort Women House Resolution activism, and I've interviewed them for my own research, the younger generation in particular did not want to focus ethnic Korean nationalism against the Japanese. They wanted to emphasize women's human rights. And they worked with over 100 to 150 different NGOs and civil society groups in the United States who had nothing to do with Korea or Korean Americans, based on human rights and peace and justice issues. So even if you have an issue that turns into a House resolution, it does not mean that nationalist rhetoric and nationalist sentiment necessarily drove it. But it does mean that certain people who capture the media can frame it that way, and we have to be very careful in that analysis. I want to ask one question toward Kayla. Could you give us a sense, based on your research, of the implications from the research? Because one thing I find interesting about going back into the archives is that for those of us who are dying to know more accurate information about North Korea, archival research, going back into history and seeing the actual documents can serve as a guiding light. So give us some sense of implications from your research that would help us understand North Korea and its interactions with other neighbors better today. And then we'll go back to the audience.
Okay, apologies, since with the slides, debacle, I was not able to finish talking about this, and I appreciate you asking the question so I can bring up the topic again and speak on it. So some of the specific points. So I mentioned the 1988 South Korean Olympics, and this is a particularly interesting point because here is North and South Korea engaging in very much what we refer to as a legitimacy war. And so through the documents, when you look at Ingeborg and you look at Bergmann's interaction, she's speaking with people from South Korea, constantly asking about what is the North Korean perspective. And you're also seeing them speaking about whether or not the East Germany will be in the Olympics, whether or not East Germany will side with their fellow friend, North Korea, or if they will side with their, technically ideological foes and actually attend the 88 Olympics. And in the end, they do attend the 88 Olympics, and North Korea boycotts the entirety of the Olympics. And so this is one area where you can directly see the relationships and the maneuvers and the negotiations that are going on. And one of the things that's fascinating to see that follows is that because of Bergmann's situation, not only does she talk to the South Korean side and get the perspective of the 88 Olympics, but she also is involved in the North Koreans' legitimacy war side, where North Korea, in some sense, internationally retaliates to the fact that they were not included in the way that they think they should have been, or at all, in the Olympics. And that was by hosting, in 1988, they hosted a large scholar meeting in North Korea where they invited over 100 different scholars, mostly from communist countries, to come to North Korea, to visit North Korea, travel around North Korea, and experience North Korea. They also held the 1989 World Youth Festival. And this was a World Youth Festival for youth and scholars, and this was an invitation to all communist countries to invite hundreds upon hundreds of students. There's documents, not specifically these, but other ones that I've worked with, that list the cost of just shipping, the material that they're going to be writing on. So like shipping like notepads or shipping pencils and everything, and it's orders of at the thousands for students to participate. And so this is really fascinating to see because Ingeborg is involved. She was one of the scholars who went to North Korea for that conversation before the Olympics, and then she was one of the people involved in the planning committee and putting together for the World Youth Festival. And so this is something interesting because you can see the debate going back and forth and how that
specifically you're talking about the competition between the North and South for international recognition and legitimacy.
Yes.
Okay? And actually the conference, I call South Korea, is crazy about conference diplomacy right now. Every time you go out to South Korea and Seoul, especially, every major hotel seems to be sponsoring at least 2, if not more, international conferences. And in a way, North Korea has its own version, whether it's in taekwondo or whether it's in with youth or whether it's music festivals. And so we see this kind of competition continuing. Let's go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say it's also the idea of North Korea fighting back through North Korean characteristics. So what is it that they're comfortable with? And you said it perfectly, like the conference style of engagement. So,
thank you. So we'll go back to the audience. The lady back there. Can you please wait for the mic?
I'm sorry. Good afternoon. I'm Lois, and I was at another conference. I'm a journalist as well, and it was on Asians, and they were talking about the Japanese and the Chinese, that there's enmity between the two, so much so that when they pass in each other's cities, they'll dash a window or break a window or do something against the other one. And now you're saying that possibly the Koreans have enmity against the Japanese. What is it that you think causes this between these two Asian groups to be against one, namely the Japanese?
It's a very simple answer. Colonial past. Japan colonized South Korea for about 36 years. Japan committed unspeakable massacres in some parts of China and also established a Japan-dominated government in a region of China. So past warfare and past colonial or quasi-colonial experiences have left this kind of a bitter taste in China and South Korea. Unlike the German case, there was no international pressure for Japan to apologize for and recognize and apologize for some of these atrocities. Could we?
Gregory Ho from Radio Free Asia. My question is about a facts-fighting question open to the floor concerning the North Koreans' espionage activity and their cyber warfare capabilities. Are there any concrete facts that they have technology transfer from China? Are there any concrete evidence that Beijing government do provide assistance to their so-called invisible ally, to their brothers to do something that as a watchdog to do the dirty jobs that the Chinese government might not want to do?
Okay, we got it. Thank you. Another question? Okay, I think this one's yours.
Thank you for your question. So I was part of another CSIS project over the past 2 years, and we actually tried to look heavily into your question, specifically as to whether there was any support from Beijing, the government, or any related agencies on giving direct, either text transfer or sort of like personnel assistance to building North Korea's cyber warfare program or other cyber operations programs. And this might be just a limitation of our open source research and the limitations of what we can do and cannot do, but we actually weren't able to find any direct evidence that was the case. And when we trace how sort of North Korea's thinking on cyber developed, a lot of it is actually continuous from other domains of operation. So you see their first cyber units being sort of a quasi-electronic warfare unit, which started adopting some of these cyber elements into their mission, and so that's how they sort of naturally evolved into this new issue area. And we weren't able to sort of pinpoint to any testimonies or direct evidence that there was any assistance from Beijing involved in that.
Okay, thank you. I have one question for Mintaro, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Mintaro, I find it really interesting that in our earlier panel on identities and power, Tian Bang had talked about the literal fabrication, the facilitation through fabrication of nationalistic goods, commercial items, whether tangible or intangible, that actually reproduces anti-Japanese nationalist sentiment, and or you could say, anti-whichever country sentiment in many of these countries in Asia. And yet, in your talk, you emphasize the need for people-to-people level reconciliation. And so I'm wondering, how can people-to-people level reconciliation between Japan and Korea proceed while there is also this growth and proliferation of the commodification of anti-Japanese goods, sentiments, we could say propaganda, pop culture items in South Korea, and then similarly vice versa in Japan?
I don't think those trends are mutually exclusive, and I think it's indicative of the strong anti-Japanese sentiment that you're seeing, that sort of commodification. But I don't think it excludes any sort of people-to-people effort to have frank discussions about textbooks among historians or something like that. I think, as you pointed out, civil society is not monolithic. And so the key is for initiative to happen in the other direction from this commodification in Japan and Korea. So I don't think the two are exclusive.
Okay. Maybe people in the audience can have a startup and do some crowd fundraising. What is it? Crowdsourcing fundraising, whatever you call it. I'm not of this generation. To create a commodification of peace and reconciliation between Japan and Korea, T-shirts and tourist, opportunities. You can have a counter commodification to improve Japan-Korea relations. So on that note, we will end this panel and we'll move on to our last and final panel focusing on North Korea. Thank you very much.